All right, here we go. Good afternoon and welcome. And for those who don't know me, my name is Susan Whistler and I'm the Mount's Executive Director. And thank you. Before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping notes. The tent is working out beautifully. We love it, but the mosquitoes do too. So if you need any bug spray, just raise your hand and we have little packets that we can hand out to you. And following the lecture, there will be a book signing in that corner. And lastly, please remember to turn off your cell phones. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to share a little bit about 3 of our upcoming events this week. For those early risers among us, throughout the summer, you can join us on Tuesdays at 8 for outdoor yoga or a bird walk. Every Tuesday until August 31, Lennox Yoga is blending nature with movement in a class that is designed for all levels. At the same time, Mass Audubon guides are here, sharing their passion for birds and leading our weekly bird walks. On these walks, you'll learn how to identify birds by sight and sound, as well as useful tips for birding in a multiplicity of habitats. And this Friday from 5 to 6, 12 youth dancers from Berkshire Pulse. Berkshire Pulse's Summer Intensive will be presenting a site-specific performance that they have created that is inspired by the Mount's history and natural and architectural spaces. And you can find out more about these events by either calling our office, stopping by, or visiting our website, edithwharton.org. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's author. Janice Nimura once declared to her college guidance counselor that the one thing she knew she would never be was a historian. She thought she wanted to be a doctor, but her life took a decidedly different turn. Janice majored in English at Yale, had a successful stint in publishing, moved to Japan with her husband, and completed an MA in East Asian Studies at Columbia upon her return. During this period, Janice grew to understand that history is made of stories, and she fell in love with archival treasure hunting, especially when it led to the forgotten lives of border-crossing 19th century women. In her latest project, The Doctor's Blackwell, Janice circles back to her first interest in medicine, but in the context of her ongoing work in women's history. The New York Times Book Review praises Nimura's work as, quote, a richly detailed and propulsive biography that doesn't strain to fit the sisters into either the narrow shape allowed to feminist pioneers as either virtuous role models or, quote, badass rebels against society. Instead, the sisters emerged as spiky, complicated human beings who strove and stumbled toward an extraordinary achievement and then had to learn what to do with it. So please join me in welcoming Janice Nimura.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you to all of the extraordinary people who work here at the Mount for making this my first in-person event. Woo! I'm glad that the podium is here because I'm not used to being seen from the waist down. Okay. I also want to tell a little story right up front to this particular audience about why making this the first in-person event that I get to tell the Blackwell story is especially special. 5 years ago, some of you may remember, I came here to talk about Daughters of the Samurai. And at dinner on the Monday night, which was exactly a year ago, as I think Google told me yesterday, there was a dinner. I was sitting next to a woman who was a docent at the Mount, whose name is Julie Quain, who's sitting right there in the flowered shirt. And she said, "So what are you working on next, Janice?" And I said, "Well, one idea I'm sort of thinking about is the story of Elizabeth and Emily Blackwell. Have you ever heard of them?" And she said, "Yep. I'm a retired medical librarian. Would you like some help?" And I said, "Yup." And Julie became the first person to help me on this journey toward the Blackwells. So, at dinner tonight, whoever is sitting next to me is going to have to tell me what I'm doing next, okay? I'm counting on you. So, and I don't know, generally I do this talk with slides. In this wonderful tent, there's no room for slides, but a lot of what I'm describing are images that are included in the book. If you happen to have a book in your lap, you'll find a lot of them. So I'm going to try to talk vividly, and then you can look at the pictures later. Okay, so the Blackwell sisters. If you have heard the name Blackwell at all, you may be familiar with the name Elizabeth Blackwell. It probably, into your mind, then pops the phrase first woman doctor. She was the first woman in this country to receive a medical degree in 1849. Her sister Emily followed in her footsteps to become the third woman doctor in 1854, and together they founded the New York Infirmary for Indigent Women and Children in 1857. And then the Women's Medical College of the New York Infirmary. So I encountered the Blackwell sisters' story for the first time 6 years ago, about a year before I came here to talk. This astonished me that I had never heard of them until then, because I grew up in the city where they practiced. I went to a proudly feminist all-girls school from the age of 5. I was the math science kid at that school. I graduated with the intention of pursuing medicine, although I was then seduced by the humanities. How was it possible I had never heard of the Blackwell sisters? How could that be? So I asked around a little bit, and what I discovered was that the people who had heard the name, and there weren't many, had only heard of Elizabeth Blackwell. And when they said, "Oh yes, I know who Elizabeth Blackwell is," they then said, "I had a book about her when I was 7. And it's true. There are a lot of versions of the Blackwell story on the children's biography shelf, and they're all fairly similar. They all feature slender, well-dressed, elegant women, bending solicitously over grateful patients, and wearing a stethoscope. Every single one. You can look for it. There's even a picture book version for little kids that shows Elizabeth Blackwell with little red bows in her hair, but there's a medical bag next to her on the front with a stethoscope, waiting for her to grow up. The thing is, as I discovered when I followed Elizabeth and Emily into the archives and started listening to their voices in their journals and diaries and letters, these books left a lot of things out. Even the stethoscopes were wrong, because in the 1840s, when they were studying medicine, stethoscopes in general were still the single monaural kind that you would put up to your ear and then put the other end on the patient like that. These children's books were sanitized, they were simplified, they left out Emily almost entirely. And I became really interested in reintroducing Elizabeth and Emily Blackwell to the present in all of their complicated glory. They were not always easy to like, and that was surprising. They weren't sort of Disney-level feminist icons, and that was interesting to me. I wanted to know their whole story, not just what fit in those picture books. So what is that story, briefly? 8 of the 9 Blackwell siblings were born in Bristol, England. They came to this country in 1832 as children. They were the sons and daughters of a paradox. A man named Samuel Blackwell, who had made his money in the sugar refining industry, and spent all of his free time as an ardent abolitionist. There's a contradiction there, if you think about it for a second. He was a dreamer, though. He was a dissenter from the Church of England. He raised his 5 daughters with the same level of education as his 4 sons, and he moved his whole family from Bristol to the New World via New York, and then all the way out to the edge of the known world, which in 1838 was Cincinnati, on the strength of a dream, the dream of making sugar from sugar beets, not Caribbean cane that depended on enslaved labor, but beets that could be grown in the north with free labor, thereby sort of fixing the moral hygiene of his industry. And he got them all the way out to Cincinnati, and a month after they got there, in August of 1838, before they had really finished unpacking, he died, leaving his now 9 children and widow with $20. And his 5 daughters with a clear sense that having a husband is no guarantee of security. None of his 5 daughters married. All of them made their living in some way, in interesting ways, unusual ways. So the 9 Blackwell siblings, orphaned at the edge of civilization, become a tribe, and they become a great gift to their biographer because they thought of each other more highly than anyone else in the world. They really turned inward toward each other, and they all drove each other a little nuts, which meant they were always leaving and writing to each other about each other. a huge boon to a 21st century storyteller. There were thousands and thousands of pieces of Blackwell material. If you've ever done any Victorian archival research, you will know that that can be a challenge in itself. In the early to mid 19th century, when paper and postage were both very expensive, you would do something called cross-writing, which would be you'd fill the page, and then you'd turn it 90 degrees, and you'd fill it again on top of what you just wrote. And then sometimes you'd flip it over and do it again, both. So you have this grid of ornate script. I happen to like cracking those kinds of codes, so I enjoyed that kind of thing. A lot of people would run screaming, but I really loved the archival part of this work. Elizabeth was born in 1821. She just had her 200th birthday on February 3rd of this year. She was voraciously brilliant, socially quite awkward, and blessed with a healthy sense of self-worth. She admired the transcendentalist writer Margaret Fuller, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with Margaret Fuller's writing. Margaret Fuller, in the mid-1840s, right when Elizabeth Blackwell was coming of age as a young adult, Margaret Fuller had published a bestseller called Woman in the 19th Century. And in this book, she declared that humanity was never going to reach a new level of enlightenment until women unleashed their own power, proved what they could do, proved that women could do anything men could do. It wasn't a matter of sex, it was a matter of talent and effort. Women could be sea captains, she said. So Elizabeth, reading this, heard herself. She thought, I can be one of these beacons that Margaret Fuller describes. I can prove that a woman can do anything a man can do, and I can be one of the leaders that demonstrates to women it's time to unleash their power. I can help humanity rise to a new level of enlightenment, a healthy ego. So she chose medicine. It was an unusual choice for her. She was not someone who loved science. She liked to read history and philosophy and literature. She read Pascal's Pensées for fun. Natural history, the intimate functions of the body, illness, none of that appealed to her. In fact, people didn't really appeal to her. Humanity appealed to her. But medicine was an unusually clear way to prove her point, because medicine in the mid-19th century was in flux, both scientifically and institutionally. To this point, it had been more of a trade, the trade of midwives and barber surgeons, whose credential was, learning from the one before them. Increasingly, though, medicine was a profession. It was a profession of men who had become credentialed by virtue of going to a medical school and earning a medical degree. So Elizabeth thought to herself, if I can find my way into a medical school and attend all of the lectures and pass all of the examinations, who can claim that I am not as qualified as any man to be a doctor? Point proved. She also knew that at this point, in the mid-1840s, that medical school was not the overwhelming challenge that I shied away from in 1989. Medical school at this moment consisted basically of two identical 16-week terms that you completed 1 year after the next, 100% lectures. Maybe you got to watch a little dissection if you were lucky. That was it. So Elizabeth, with her prodigious intellectual firepower, knew that if she could find her way into a medical school, she was not going to have all that much trouble finding her way through. So, her next challenge, find her way into a medical school. The first reaction was either hilarity or outrage, because the idea of a woman studying medicine in 1846-47, when she first started to apply, was ridiculous or appalling. What kind of woman, first of all, would leave a woman's domestic sphere and pursue a profession, first of all, that wasn't teaching or nursing or something? And also, what kind of woman would choose to study the intimate processes of the body in mixed company, in a lecture hall full of men? That's not a real lady. No real lady would do that. That's outrageous. So the people that she applied to either laughed in her face or refused to see her or just ignored her completely. She accumulated a sheaf of rejections. Finally, she received an acceptance letter. from a tiny provincial medical school in Geneva, New York, Geneva Medical College at the tip of Seneca Lake in the Finger Lakes. The descendant institutions are Hobart and William Smith Colleges, if you've ever been there. The story of her admission looks different depending on where you read it. If you read her memoir, which she wrote 50 years later, she says, "At last, after much rejection, I received an acceptance letter from Geneva College, and I bought a train ticket, and off I went, never having doubted a happy outcome." If you flip to the back of that same memoir, interestingly, in the appendix is a more accurate story of what really happened, which was that Elizabeth had been studying medicine with a sympathetic Quaker doctor in Philadelphia who was letting her read his medical library and watch what he did. And he enclosed a letter of endorsement to her application, which arrived at Geneva College. Again, a very provincial college, not a prestigious place. And medicine was what you studied if you weren't smart enough for the law. So it didn't have the prestige factor that medicine has today. The professors of Geneva College were not the most prestigious group. And they balked a little bit at rejecting the endorsement of this prestigious Philadelphia physician. So they punted. They really didn't want a woman to come study, but they weren't quite brave enough to say no. So they punted the question to their students. Again, a group of 100 rather provincial, boisterous boys, more energy than polish, and said, "Okay, boys, we are asking you to vote on the acceptance of one Elizabeth Blackwell. If any one of you doesn't think a woman should come and study among us, she won't come." And they figured, we're safe. That'll take care of that. At a raucous meeting of the students that night, any dissenters were bludgeoned into submission, and the students returned a giddy and unanimous yes to the faculty the next day, thinking that this was a practical joke being played on them by a rival institution, clearly. This wasn't really real, and that their professors were giving them an opportunity to make mischief. They forgot all about it until 3 weeks later when Elizabeth Blackwell walked into the lecture hall. So once she was admitted to Geneva College, two things happened. One, her classmates and faculty quickly recognized that she belonged there, that she was operating at a level of intellect and determination that just blew all of them away. In fact, you were probably going to do much better in medical school if you sat next to Elizabeth. And the other thing that happened was that she started to think of medicine as an intellectual challenge worthy of her talents. She had gone into it to prove a point, but once she found herself in the college, she really started to enjoy the challenge of it. Between terms, right, there was one winter term of 16 weeks. In between that, you were meant to go off somewhere and get some practical experience. So she went back to Philadelphia and found her way to Blockley Almshouse, which at the time was the largest municipal hospital in America. You have to remember that in 1848 now, a hospital did not have the same connotation that it has for us today. A hospital was not a place that you went to get better from anything. A hospital was a place that you went when you had nowhere else to go. They were essentially warehouses for the destitute, hadn't moved on very much from this idea of an almshouse, a refuge for the poor and ill. At Blockley, Elizabeth's room was off the female syphilis ward. Tertiary syphilis, if I had slides, this is when you would go, was not a joke. There was none of the antibiotics or any of the medications that you would treat it with today. If you were in Blockley Almshouse suffering from syphilis, you had necrotic lesions in your skull. You had mental decline because of the brain damage, both from the syphilis and from the mercury treatment that was used to treat it. Elizabeth started to make connections at Blockley between ideas of poverty and disease, ideas about public health, ideas about sexually transmitted diseases and the plight of women. She was making connections beyond medical practice into wider social issues. She was also learning a lot about epidemic disease because 1848, waves of refugees were arriving both from continental Europe and from Ireland. They were overflowing the beds at Blockley with what was then known as ship fever, typhus, epidemic typhus. Elizabeth chose typhus as her thesis subject for her graduation from Geneva College. Interestingly strikingly not a woman's medical issue. She was choosing something that was, I think, rather strikingly gender neutral to write about. She returned to Geneva and graduated at the top of her class in January of 1849. Her thesis on ship fever, published as the lead article in the Buffalo Medical Journal that month. She wasn't just making it through med school. She was a comet. She was a streak of light. No one had really seen anything like that before. But again, she graduated from med school with an alarming level of practical ignorance, because you didn't learn very much about treating patients in medical school. So she did what many medical graduates of the moment in America did to gain experience and some prestige. She went to Europe, which was where the real centers of medical education were. Paris, London, Edinburgh. Elizabeth went to Paris, where the medical education was particularly good, state-sponsored, free, extremely progressive, extremely practice-based. She was excited to go and learn at a new and higher level, and discovered that every element of medical education in Paris was barred to her because she refused to dress as a man and pretend to be one in order to access it. The whole point was to be a woman doctor, right? To prove that a woman could do this. Doing it in drag was not going to be enough for Elizabeth. So she made an interesting choice. She chose to enter a municipal maternity hospital called La Maternité, which was a teaching hospital for young women from all over France training to be midwives. They would come, young women, untrained, come and live there as students and learn how to be midwives before going back to their departments in the provinces. Elizabeth already had an MD, but she knew that the volume of cases that she could see in obstetrics in this building, which was housed in an old convent that I got to explore when we visited Paris, which was great, that the volume of cases she could see there would exceed any other excellent way of learning. So in she went. And it was there at La Maternité that she underwent a crisis that would change the shape of her career, if not its direction. I mentioned hospitals were not where you went to get better. Hospitals were certainly not where you went to have a baby if you had any money at all. The doctor came to you. If you were going to a hospital to deliver, it meant you had nowhere else to go. It often meant you were a prostitute. Many of the women who were delivering at La Maternité were suffering from venereal diseases. And when a woman with gonorrhea gives birth, the child passing through the birth canal can be infected with something called gonococcal conjunctivitis, an eye infection which today, while not a joke, would be easily treatable with antibiotics. In 1849, there were none. Elizabeth was treating an infant infected in this way. Early one morning, she was washing its infected eye when some of the liquid she was using splashed into her own face. And she contracted gonococcal conjunctivitis and was immediately confined to bed in the hospital where she had been working. And for weeks, the fate of her vision hung in the balance. No one knew whether she would see again. She had befriended one of the physicians, the attending physicians at La Maternité, the wonderfully named Dr. Hippolyte Blot, who was, if I had a slide, you would see, was as beautiful as his name. They had become friends, and now he became his physician. And this is a good moment to sort of demonstrate what it feels like to be the storyteller working with multiple versions of events that happened almost 200 years ago, and braid together something that approximates the truth. In Elizabeth's memoir, again 50 years later, this is how she described the ordeal of this illness. Ah, how dreadful it was to find the daylight gradually fading as my kind doctor bent over me and removed with an exquisite delicacy of touch the films that had formed over the pupil. I could see him for a moment clearly, but the sight soon vanished and the eye was left in darkness. Sounds like a romance novel, right? Okay, so luckily for Elizabeth, and coincidentally, in Paris at this very moment was her eldest sister, Anna Blackwell. And again, if I had a slide to show you of Anna Blackwell, you would see her kind of posed in an elaborate dress like this. Because Anna was a drama queen. She was also a hypochondriac and a journalist. So she spent her days rushing to Elizabeth's bedside to help tend to her sister in her illness, and her evenings writing endless letters home to Cincinnati about the state of Elizabeth's eye, with gusto. She wrote things like, "The pupil presents just now the appearance of one of those little misshapen blackberries of 3 granulations and half dried up that one sees so often on some scrubby little bush. If you can fancy one such in dull-looking lead, you have just the appearance of this poor eye." So, you have to mediate between accounts like that in order to get at what really happened. Elizabeth eventually lost one eye to this illness and was fitted for a glass eye that she wore for the rest of her life, although very few people knew that she was operating with this disability. But it did change the focus of her medical career. Surgery was now not an option. And even reading could be painful and difficult. So more and more she was being guided in the direction to which she was already oriented, which was public health. Ideas about hygiene, ideas about poverty and health. Did she go back to Cincinnati to recover and get used to her new glass eye? No. She was Elizabeth Blackwell, and she was formidable. As soon as she had recovered, she went on to London to continue studying in another big municipal public hospital called St. Bartholomew's, which is still there. I had a wonderful time in the archives there as well. In London, now we're at about 1851, she made the fateful acquaintance of a young woman who was a friend of friends, a young woman named Florence Nightingale. Who in 1851 was not yet Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp, the heroine of the Crimean War. The Crimean War was years in the future. Florence Nightingale in 1851 was a young woman from a wealthy family who really wanted to see her married and settled. And she wanted none of that. She had big ideas about public health and what she might be able to do for humanity. I like to think that her encounter with Elizabeth Blackwell was something of a catalyst for her fame, because here is Elizabeth Blackwell, a young woman only a year older than Florence Nightingale, I believe, who had just earned a medical degree in America, then turned her back on her family and any idea of marriage to traipse across Europe gaining medical experience. Elizabeth Blackwell was proof to Florence Nightingale that this was possible, that the ideas that she thought about and dreamed about were something that she might be able to do. They had an ecstatic, immediate friendship. They spent a lot of time together that spring, and then eventually bumped up against a basic difference in the way they saw their future and their missions. Florence Nightingale, as you know, believed in women as nurses and in changing the face of nursing. Elizabeth Blackwell had staked her life on proving that women could be doctors. And although they used each other's ideas throughout their lives and were always entwined, they never agreed on this. And there was always a certain degree of tension between them. So now it's 1852. Elizabeth has finished her training in Europe, and she decides that she is going to go back to New York. That's where she's going to choose to hang out her shingle, and she assumes that she is going to have an excellent immediate success there because, of course, women will want to consult a woman about the embarrassing, intimate details of their gynecological ills. She assumes that she will have an instant practice there. She goes to New York, she hangs out her shingle, and no one shows up. Why not? Well, in 1852, in New York as elsewhere, the very phrase female physician was a problem. Female physician did not mean bright young woman with a medical degree. Female physician meant abortionist. It meant someone like Madame Restel, the notorious Fifth Avenue abortionist, who was much in the news at this point, caricatured as a demon, a baby-eating demon in the popular press, in and out of courtrooms because she was often on the wrong side of the law. A female physician was not someone that nice people consulted. A female physician operated in the shadows, on the wrong side of the law. That didn't work. So Elizabeth found herself suddenly becalmed. After all these successes, suddenly somewhat dismayed, not sure how to find her way forward. Meanwhile, she had anointed her sister Emily, 5 years younger than she, to follow her into medicine. She knew that medicine as a woman was going to be a lonely and steep path, and she wanted company. She esteemed her Blackwell sisters more than any other women in the world. In fact, most other women in the world she had no time for. So Emily, the most brilliant of her sisters, I anoint you, Emily. I claim you to follow me into medicine. And Emily, interestingly, had a much more science-minded mind. She was much more scientifically oriented. And she was also used to listening to her three rather overbearing older sisters. So she surveyed her options and said, okay, I'll take that challenge. You would think that being the second Blackwell sister to try to go to medical school, she would have had an easier time, but you would be wrong. She had a harder time because not only had the male medical colleges slammed their doors more firmly shut after Elizabeth managed to succeed, but in those years, the early 1850s, the first female medical colleges had begun to open in response to women who were inspired by Elizabeth Blackwell and wanted to study. There was one in Boston and there was one in Philadelphia. And as long as there were female medical colleges, none of the men's schools needed to admit a woman. They could say, go there, that's for you. The Blackwells thought that both of those female medical colleges were inferior and mediocre. Emily was determined to get a degree that was no less prestigious than the one her sister had earned, so she actually struggled even harder. Started out at Rush in Chicago, where she had a wonderful first year, after which the trustees got cold feet and said, actually, please don't come back. Instead of giving up, she pivoted to Cleveland Medical College, which has evolved into Case Western, and finally received her medical degree there in 1854. Then she too needed some practical experience. So she went to Europe as well, to the one city that Elizabeth hadn't gone to, Edinburgh. There was always a slightly competitive tension between them. And Emily Blackwell attached herself to the practice of Sir James Young Simpson, one of the most prominent physicians in Britain at the time. He was a professor at the University of Edinburgh in obstetrics and gynecology. He was by appointment to the Queen. He was also something of a showman. He was the man who had discovered the anesthetic properties of chloroform in 1847. The story went that he discovered them by passing a decanter of chloroform around at his dining table, whereupon he and all of his friends burst into hysterical laughter and passed out under the table. So he was a showman. I like to think that he enjoyed the shock value of having a woman among his assistants. He would tell a story about, or Emily told the story about how delighted Simpson would be when he would call Dr. Blackwell into the next room, and out of the next room would come a woman. He enjoyed that. But he was teaching her at a very high level. He was teaching her the use of gynecological instruments that she would then draw in the margins of her letters back to Elizabeth, who was not learning very much without patients in New York. He was a pioneer of the pelvic exam and taught her how to do that after her initial shock. She realized what a potent diagnostic tool it was. And she's teaching all of this to Elizabeth in her letters. These were some of my favorite letters to read. From the beginning, I wanted this book to be the story of both Elizabeth and Emily, the doctors Blackwell, not just Elizabeth Blackwell, first woman doctor. But there's a problem built into that project, which is that there is just more material about Elizabeth. She wrote more was written about her, she published more of what she wrote was preserved because she was the first, and Emily had a much lower profile. So what do you do when you want to make a double portrait but you don't have an equal amount of material? Well, one of the things you can do is get out of the archive and start following your subjects around. Do what they describe. See if you can feel what they felt. So I went to Edinburgh, poor me. And I followed Emily around. I took every letter she'd written, and I did all the things that she described. And it was ecstatically fun. I did things like go to 52 Queen Street, which was Simpson's residence, which still stands. It's the only house in the row with an extra story because his practice and his family were bursting at the seams. The day that I went by 52 Queen Street to check it out, the door was open. So in the spirit of following in the footsteps, I walked in. It's a drug counseling center now, so I wasn't really trespassing. They didn't really want me there, but I got to wander around a little bit before they asked me to wander back out again. And I got to see things like what it felt like to be Emily walking into that door every day from her lodgings, walking up to the second floor to Simpson's consulting rooms. His initials still worked into the wrought iron banister of the staircase, which tells you both how it felt to be Emily walking up the stairs and something about Simpson. What kind of guy puts his initials in his banister? Those kinds of details are the ones that light up the story in a new way. I also got to go to the Royal College of Surgeons Museum in Edinburgh, and if you are ever in Edinburgh and you like medical history and scary things in jars, I totally recommend the the museum. It's wonderful. And it was full of Simpson artifacts, like his pocket pill case that he took on house calls that said, "Please return to 52 Queen Street," under the lid, or his monaural stethoscopes, those one-ear stethoscopes that I wanted to believe Emily might have used. They were made of rosewood and ivory. Maybe she handled them. There was even the decanter that he was said to have poured the chloroform from. So Emily is learning from Simpson at the highest level, and really perfecting her craft, even at a higher level than Elizabeth, because of course she's more interested in surgery also. This is not enough to protect her from some of the same snark that Elizabeth was victim to in the press. People were not kind to a woman who dared to do this. One memorable caricature, which you can find in the book, from Punch, which was the London satiric newspaper of the time, showed Emily wearing the outrageous bloomer costume of the women's rights movement, a member of which Emily actually was not, interestingly, but wearing bloomers and a ridiculous hat and squinting through spectacles at the only patient who would, of course, consult a woman doctor, which was a lapdog, being clutched in the arms of a much more conventionally feminine woman in a hoop skirt. That was the kind of image people had of women doctors. I think the accompanying article hoped that she would soon settle down and get married, because really the only use for a woman doctor was to take better care of her husband and children, of course. Luckily, both Elizabeth and Emily were very good at ignoring this kind of silliness. Emily, now having finished her training abroad, finally converges with Elizabeth back in New York, where in 1857, together, they found the New York Infirmary for Indigent Women and Children, an unusual institution for several reasons. The first hospital entirely staffed by women. And its point not just to serve the poor women of the tenement neighborhoods with female physicians, but also to provide a place for the slowly growing numbers of female medical graduates to have a place to get practical experience, to do their internship and residency without having to go to Europe. The infirmary was founded in a building that still stands. If you are in New York at all, in Greenwich Village, there's a building on the corner of Bleecker and Crosby Streets, a little unprepossessing brick building, still there. I was privileged to get to know the woman who makes it her home, and she allowed me to write the chapter about the infirmary in the building, which made the ghosts feel very close. I love those opportunities. As you might expect for people who founded a hospital in 1857, the Blackwells had a role to play in the Civil War. In 1861, in April, just after the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, Elizabeth and Emily called a meeting in their own parlor, a meeting of their supporters and their donors. There was a lot of unfocused energy in New York around the Union cause. A lot of women wanted to support it. Nobody knew how to focus that energy. And out of that meeting, they drafted an appeal that ran in the New York Times the next day, an appeal to the women of New York who wanted to help. And in response to that appeal, which directed them to come to a meeting, thousands of women converged on the Great Hall of Cooper Union the next day. Cooper Union, also a building that's still there. Out of this meeting grew something called the Women's Central Association of Relief. And out of the Women's Central Association of Relief grew the U.S. Sanitary Commission. So you can sort of draw a straight line from the Blackwells parlor to the most important civilian organization of the Civil War. Elizabeth and Emily, as you might expect, found themselves at the head of the committee charged with identifying, vetting, and training young women to be nurses at the front. For a moment, it felt like sort of a Margaret Fullerian culmination. Here they were, standing shoulder to shoulder with men in the service of a great cause, doing work that was important together. But dismay and disillusion soon set in. It turned out that the male physicians of New York were not totally ready to stand shoulder to shoulder with female physicians. The Blackwells Infirmary was left off the list of institutions that would be able to train these women. Dorothea Dix was put in the highest female leadership role in Washington. She had no medical experience. Elizabeth liked to call her the meddler-in-chief. The Blackwell sisters became a little frustrated, and they eventually, after the first year of the war and training at about 100 nurses, pulled out and redirected their attentions away from the war effort and toward their next project, which was somewhat ironic. The Blackwells had always intended for women and men to study medicine together. That's why they had gone to men's medical colleges, to prove that women could do this. But instead of having men's medical colleges throw their doors open, instead, women's medical colleges had opened. And as I had mentioned, they found these colleges inferior. And they, in fact, knew they were inferior because the graduates were coming to their infirmary with an alarming degree of ignorance. So what to do about this problem in women's medical education? Well, what to do was to change their minds and to open a medical college of their own, attached to the New York Infirmary, and operating at a higher level of rigor than even the programs they themselves had attended at men's colleges. Their medical school would be 3 years instead of 2. It would be cumulative instead of repeating the same courses. The courses would build on each other, and it would be, of course, partly taught in their infirmary with practical training at the bedside. In many ways, the Blackwells New York Women's Medical College of the New York Infirmary was a harbinger of advances in medical education. In some ways, they pushed the needle toward progress in medical education. So that was their professional lives. Personally, their lives were just as interesting. Both sisters adopted daughters in very different ways, and tellingly different ways. Emily lived for the last several decades of her life with a female partner, a fellow surgeon named Elizabeth Cushier. Two of their brothers, Henry and Sam, married two of the most prominent feminist activists of the day, Lucy Stone, a suffrage activist, and Antoinette Brown, who was the first woman in this country to be ordained as a minister. To complicate the story further, Elizabeth and Emily didn't really see eye to eye with their feminist sisters-in-law. In Elizabeth and Emily's minds, the women's rights movement kind of had it backward. The vote shouldn't necessarily be the first priority. They did not join in sisterhood with their sisters-in-law. They also didn't always agree about the role of women in medicine with each other. Elizabeth, increasingly, as I mentioned, thought more and more about public health. She believed that the role of a woman in medicine as a doctor was really to be a teacher armed with science. Emily really thought that a woman doctor should be as good a surgeon and a practitioner and a medical professor as a man. And that's what she wanted to be. So after the Women's Medical College was founded in 1869, the sisters, with some relief, parted ways and spent the last 40 years of their lives on different continents. Elizabeth went back to England, where she had always wanted to return ever since she had left there as a girl, and pursued much less practice and much more moral reform, public health, policy, writing and lecturing. Emily remained in New York and ran the institutions that they had founded for the rest of her life, very successfully, and in some ways, ironically, sustaining Elizabeth's legacy almost to the detriment of her own, because today we don't know about Emily. We only ever heard of Elizabeth if we've heard of either of them. So that's the outline of the story. And this moment, as we celebrate the inauguration of our first female vice president and do nothing but talk about public health, it feels like a particularly good moment for the Blackwell story. As a story of female icons who aren't always what you expect female icons to be. I wish I had one slide that I like to put up at this point. If you go home and Google Elizabeth Blackwell, and you go to images, in the first few rows, always, you will see a small sepia photo of a beautiful young woman, very attractively dressed, sort of with dewy, beautiful skin, and lovely hair, and her eyes gazing at the future. She looks sort of like somebody's evocation of Jo March from Little Women, you know, somebody looking to break the barriers of the future. And I have seen this picture accompanying websites about Elizabeth Blackwell, articles, documentary films, at least one biography. It's on the cover. This is not a picture of Elizabeth Blackwell. It's probably a picture of one of her nieces. You can tell because when you go and find the photo, the original photo at the Museum of the City of New York, you can flip it over and see the ad of the photo studio where it was taken, which didn't exist until Elizabeth Blackwell was in her 60s. And this is clearly not a picture of a 60-year-old woman. So why? Why this misidentification that persists and persists? it's because it's the way we want Elizabeth Blackwell to look. You know, when you're doing your report in 10th grade on Elizabeth Blackwell and you go to images to find a picture of her, you flip past all the pictures of the crusty middle-aged ladies and you find this lovely image of a woman who looks like the fantasy storybook hero version of a feminist icon. And to me, why I fell in love with these women who are difficult a lot of the time is precisely because of that. They were prickly but fabulous women. I think this is a really important moment in our history as a nation to embrace the idea that female leadership doesn't have to be beautiful, adorable, elegant, or likable. Sometimes it's just powerful. And to be able to recognize that kind of leadership in whatever package it comes in. Thank you for listening.